You're listening to the Art Said podcast, episode number 10, Context is Everything. Welcome to the Art Said podcast, conversations through the perspective of the arts and education, hosted by educators and artists Shauna Longo and Edric DeBose.
Hey folks, so today's episode, the title for it roughly is Context is Everything. So this episode it's an extension of the conversations we had before with musician and educator Brian Hargrove. He was talking about his tenure at Santa Fe University of Art and Design. Very quickly, Brian Hargrove is a musician, producer. He's worked with a bunch of people, everybody, probably most well known for being the bass player and musical director of the live band for the rap group Public Enemy, headed by Chuck D. He's also worked with, Fred Wesley, with members of the James Brown Band, Stuart Copeland from the Police to Fred Schneider of the B-52s and everything on down. He's produced a bunch of different people. He also has a radio show, but he's also done, like I said, he has for about 2.5 years. He was at the Santa Fe University of Art and Design, and we were talking with him about some of his experiences in education, and he said something that sparked this episode. So Sean and I we heard it, and it's an idea that exists in many places, so we wanted to take a look at it and break it down. So what he said was why something is said to a student can be just as important, if not more important, than what is said. Now, we've all heard that in different versions. I think the first time I heard it was something like, what you do is not as important as how you do it. And how you do it is not as important as why you do it. And even in Japanese culture, because my wife's Japanese, so there's expressions in Japanese culture of, if you look at kudo, right, which is the Japanese form for archery, if you look at the characters, it's the way of archery. Ikebana, which is flower arrangement, it's the way of arranging flowers, right? Karate is the way of the hand. So this idea that the way you do something is just as important as what it is you're doing. So we want to look at some of the ideas that have to do with that why and what in education. And there are a lot of different angles that come up on with this why and what idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And so often, like, a cited weakness in public education is the idea of teaching know what, like, as information. What do we need the kids to know, as opposed to know how, which focuses more on the application of information. And so this leads down that, I don't know if I want to say slippery slope, but the path of, teaching to the test or focus on state testing mentality that we know permeates in public education in America. And it's a hot button topic, and it's frequently brought up. And as arts educators, we definitely are grateful in some ways that we don't have to teach to the test. Yet, in a way, if you have an art show, an annual, like a district art show, like I'm in the midst of programming right now, or you're a music teacher and you have a concert coming up, or a production for theater, or a dance recital, those are, if you're preparing for them, oftentimes even arts educators teach to the test. They teach to that performance. And so sometimes we lose focus and don't have our vision as we're using this performance or this presentation of art as a way to showcase what the concepts we're teaching in class. It becomes more of, we're going to put something on display and I need to make sure what the kids do is perfect, and that shift in the focus. So as much as, we don't have state testing, in some ways, many arts teachers do teach to the test or teach to the performance or presentation. What do you think, Edric?
Or there might be situations where you are asked to the way in which you test, or your issues with assessment, or your the idea of a final, right?
Right.
Or a written final for an art class, in my case.
Right.
Things like this come up. The requirements that it's kind of understandable in one sense. Well, everybody has to do it. It's like, so. But again, even with the arts, there creeps in this thing of these mandates, or
Absolutely. And they can look different and morph into different forms, but everybody knows, I hope, what we're talking about in terms of this whole, so that angle. And the other side of it is when the kids are like, why do I have to learn this? Or why am I learning this? When the kids don't really, when it's that focus on the what as information and pushing it towards the kids, they don't necessarily understand the why. Like, why is this important to me? And so we as educators need to kind of shift, if you haven't already, the students need to connect to the concepts or the content being taught, right? Make it relatable. We've had a bunch of episodes talking about building shelves. Well, you got to build the shelf so they can then do something with it. And it falls into this and aligns with this conversation that we're having today on the podcast in terms of how can you have the kids connect with it?
I think there's also the issue of having to deal with how you're presenting your material. Or I think what I'm really talking about is falling into the trap of a certain kind of a habit where you just start producing things that have to do with what you're supposed to be making, as opposed to really pushing students to understand the whys behind it.
Absolutely.
I think sometimes you can get grinded down to a place where you kind of give up and you say, well, you know what, I'll just push these things out. Again, it certainly happens in with teaching the academic subjects.
Absolutely. And there have been a bunch of attempts in education to address this issue, right? You had PBL, STEM, STEAM. These were all brought to the table as initiatives within districts or arts integration as well, right? To try to decrease teacher-driven lectures and move towards a more student-centered, student-driven learning where students are making connections between and across contents and concepts to solve a problem or create a solution. And so having that shift of, we're going to learn this, but you got to use that information to then figure something out or put it into a context is one of the reasons we think PBL, STEM, STEAM, arts integration, these other initiatives kind of crept into our worlds.
Right, which are good things. I mean, the intent
absolutely
is always, the intent is always good. So there are ways in which we are trying to address this. I want to mention one more idea before we get to what Brian was talking about, because what's interesting is he had an angle on this that kind of took us by surprise.
Absolutely. We both thought he meant something different. And then after like our conversation ended with him, Edric and I circled back to each other and both said what we thought he meant. And then we realized Edric talked to him again, and that wasn't what he meant. We both took it differently.
It was a piece of it.
Yeah.
So I just want to mention one last thing before we get into what specifically we're talking about with Brian. It's just the idea of a situated cognition, right? There's a great essay I read years ago. It's called Situated Cognition and the Culture of Learning. And what it really talks about is just that knowing is inseparable from the circumstances in which you practice something, right? So all knowledge is situated in social, cultural, and physical contexts.
And it's also activity bound, right? That knowledge is tightly attached to an activity, to doing something.
So they gave a couple of great examples. I just want to mention two of them. One of them was he talked about how about 100 years ago, everybody had pocket knives. And within a pocket knife, there was this little thing that helped you to remove stones from the hoof of a horse, right? And so people had these knives. They knew what it was. You know what a horse is. You know what horseshoes are. But how many people actually knew how to use that thing? If they ran into a horse that was limping, to actually take that. What situations do you use it in? How bad is the horse? Where do you place it? They don't know. So what they compared that to was how students have all these formulas and theories and hypotheses they learn in classes, but they don't really have a place to apply it. You can have all these tools, but you might not know how to use them or what to do with them.
Right. It's kind of like the idea of like an apprenticeship, right? That where you're taking what you've learned and putting it into practice.
Yes. So the other example was they talked about a math teacher who would allow students to choose the kinds of problems they wanted to deal with. One example was the magic square. It's like a tic-tac-toe 9-piece square. What you do is you then arrange the numbers 1 through 9 so that you get the same sum, either going vertically, horizontally, or diagonally. So he would ask the students to solve the equation and solve the magic. And then once they did, he would say, okay, solve it differently. So he would have them go about solving, and then he would say, okay, well, take this number, place this number in the center, and now solve for the variables. Find out hypothetically, or come up with a formula or an algorithm that helps you to compute how likely it is you're going to get similar sums with, all these different angles. And what he was doing by doing that, he was trying to get them to think like mathematicians. It wasn't a matter of solving the problem. It was how do you deal with mathematics? Because even, again, when you separate it from the practice, when you separate, the information from the practice, you lose something. So when you talk about mathematics, so you physicists, right, and engineers both use math, but they use it differently. They apply it differently. So it's really, what does it apply to, and that community and that conversation. So if the way you're teaching doesn't invite the students to participate in that community, you're losing a piece of what could be valuable in the educational process.
Absolutely. I kind of had experience with that when I was teaching middle school general music, and I turned it into a music technology course. And so kids would come to me and I would teach them the skills, the knowledge, right, of how we were utilizing, and they would have to create music in Soundtrap or GarageBand depending on the project we were working on. And so I would have kids that wouldn't know what to do. They'd be looking at me, okay, what do I need to do next? And I'd be like, well, I don't know. And I would give them parameters. We were working on a certain form of the song, right? And you need different layers talking about texture in music. But then the actual individual choices they made about what loops they wanted or what instruments they wanted to put together, there was no right answer, right? It was, what are they feeling in the moment? What are they trying to communicate? And them having to come to terms with, wait a second, they're so trained that there's a right answer, a right and wrong, that there's this teach to the test, that I had kids that would like literally break down, and they would like, I had a kid in tears one day, and it broke my heart. But then to work that child through that, because it just wasn't comfortable for them. They were not comfortable. Wait a second. Somebody's letting me have a choice. Somebody's letting me have an opinion. Someone's letting me decide how this feels, what this ends up being, still within these parameters. And so it was really this shift that took time. But once they understood and got over that like initial fear and anxiety and feeling of just not being comfortable having a choice, it was enlightening. And there was this weight lifted off of them and the trust that it built with me as the teacher and them as the student, in like, I trust your opinions. You have things to say. You have things to offer. Put that in there. And it becomes more personal, and they become more connected to it. And they have more of an understanding of the why and the application of the concepts. It's not just about me saying, now add a trumpet, now add a percussion instrument. They got to make that choice. And so kids sadly don't have as many of those experiences as I wish they would, but I think the arts are the place where they can have them. And that's, I'm going to circle back, that's how STEAM, PBL, STEM, arts integration really got some footing and some life and some push towards those initiatives, because people realized that, yeah, the arts is where it's at. That's where we can give them more of that why and that context to the learning of what it is.
And it's really about design. And there isn't a right answer, and it's about experimentation. I think part of what we're saying here is the culture of education really is what's inhibiting the students. So they've been trained to think in a particular certain kind of way. So just to get to what Brian was talking about, so he extended on his statement about what he really wanted to do was he wanted to be an unbiased, honest broker of knowledge, right? That's how he expressed it. So rather than offer his own ideas as gospel, he felt like it was really important to explain why his approach to music production, what his music production, what his choices were, and why he chose the way to produce music the way he did, so that his students were free to make other choices, if they felt like they needed to. Right. So if you're producing for, film or television or radio or, there are different kinds of techniques you'll use. But the main thing here was his approach really had to do with the idea of respecting the students' choices. Right. So realizing the educator has to be open to what the student, where the student might want to go. And that
Absolutely. And that's going to amplify their sense of agency. When we talk about social emotional learning, that's a big piece of it, is that agency that we want to instill in students.
Mhm. So I think just to getting towards closer to the close of this, in public education, it really has to do with allowing students voice or choice, right? So in my art classes, a similar thing to what you were talking about earlier, what I would let students struggle. I would let them sit there and just stare at the work they're working on until an idea came to their heads, because that's part of my process. Part of my process is I don't really know what's next, and I just have to sit there and look and wait for something to happen. But again, that's part of what student choice is. That doesn't necessarily feel comfortable for them or for you sometimes, but that's really what needs to happen. And then again, it's about preparing kids for what's coming in the future.
Absolutely, because we don't even know what jobs are going to exist. They don't exist right now that we're preparing students for. And so if we have to teach them to think, to collaborate and problem solve in order for them to be successful in their careers down the road.
Because those things are never going away. Collaboration, problem
Nope.
solving, thinking on your feet. That's, just a quick example. 30 years ago, a friend of mine, moved out to California. He worked for a company called Netscape, I think, which AOL bought at some point. They disappeared. But
Yeah.
he tried to get me to move out there with him. And he was saying, dude, come on, there's so many opportunities out here. And I said, and I was telling him, I don't really know what skills I have that I can offer. And he said something to me I'll never forget. He said, he told me I shouldn't be thinking like that. He said, because what they would hire me for hadn't been invented yet. And
That's
that really
wild.
blew my mind. It was like, and I think that continues to be true. So the jobs that kids will be working on in the future, they haven't been invented yet. We don't know what they are.
Absolutely. And as educators, we need to be clear about why we teach. Simply not simply what we teach or how we're told to teach, but why are we teaching?
Yeah. And just to close, there was one last thing. It's just I watched a video recently of an entrepreneur on entrepreneurship, and there's a woman who's speaking, and she said an important question to ask yourself at the end of the day is, did I spend most of my time doing what it is that I'm best at? Because if you're running a business or a family, right, there are going to be demands on your time. Things are going to pull you away from your focus. And if you're a teacher, standardized testing, the curriculum requirements, all those kinds of things, they're not going to disappear. District initiatives, they'll come and go. That's not going to disappear. But it's kind of like you have to find a way to fight against that. I really think it's a battle for your soul as a teacher. I really do. I'm not kidding. But so you have to find a way to carve out a niche and remember why it is you teach.
Absolutely. Like, what is your purpose? What is your passion? And always centering towards that. Because no matter what initiative comes down the pike or what's being required of you that may pull your attention from that, you have to figure out how your niche fits within that. So you can not only survive, but thrive through whatever's happening. Because there's always going to be something trying to pull you away from what your really passion and purpose is.
So that why is important on a variety of levels. I think that's what happened. So when Brian said that, it struck that chord. But yeah, your reasons why you do something or why you say something are critical, central.
Context is everything.
There it is.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you in our next episode.